Greetings, fellow carnalites. This particular podcast is going to be dedicated to the recent riots and all-around circumstances involving the Minneapolis debacle. And that's the only word I can really give to it. It is a complete and utter shit show. But for this podcast, I am going to share with you the forces that led to things getting this bad. If you are anything like me and you saw the first unedited video, it's about 10 minutes long, where the officers have, or one of them has their knee on the gentleman's neck. His name, I think it was George Floyd. How do they justify? What kind of culture creates? What kind of environment creates this this complete lack of awareness, this complete personification of control and power in a community? And we're also going to address the issues surrounding his partner, the Asian man who stood by and watched it happen. We're going to take a look at them, and we're going to take a look at all of the players surrounding them, all of the power and figureheads surrounding them, to figure out exactly what might have gone wrong, not just with them individually, but potentially the department itself and the leadership under which they were under. This is going to be a doozy, guys, and I need you to stay with me as we go through a litany of responsible parties. Here we go. All right, so the first person that we are going to look at is the first officer in question, the officer that had his knee on the neck of the now deceased. His name is Shelvin, or Shelvin, as I will call him for the rest of this podcast. According to the Associated Press, Shelvin was one of 6 officers who fired their weapons into another. I need to back up. I apologize. This officer had been involved in not one, not two, but 3 other previous situations where he had opened fire and either killed or injured civilians, and he was not disciplined. He was not given any write-ups. No investigation was launched into his behavior, and we're just going to go over these 3 really quickly. According to the Associated Press, Shelvin was one of 6 officers who fired the weapons in the 2006 death of Wayne Riots, who police said pointed a sawed-off shotgun at officers after stabbing 2 people. Shelvin shot and wounded a man in 2008 in a struggle after Shelvin and his partner responded after his partner and he responded to a reported domestic assault. And in 2011, Shelvin was one of several officers put on temporary leave after a police shooting in a residential community, according to news reports. Now, this man has already been connected to several shootings, a lot of which, at least 2 of which, involved death. And this third one, as we can see from his demeanor, indicates a pattern of behavior and almost a cold disregard for those in his community. And the question that I was asking myself as I was reading these reports and as I watched the video is, how exactly does that happen? And as I looked into their records, the answer apparently is because of unreported and internal investigations. In other words, these officers would go out to calls. They would be asked to make a report, and they would not make the report. Not only this, when they would fail to make a report, the citizens would complain to the department and to their community, and most of these reports, most of these complaints would go unanswered, unresolved, no disciplinary action, no investigation whatsoever, despite the families and individuals being contacted by an investigator. Nothing would go forward. And we'll go over these specific cases in regards to Mr. Shelvin. The first of which was an encounter with Mr. Berg, who encountered Shelvin in May of 2013 as he and some of his friends participated in an annual end-of-the-year ritual called quote-unquote Assassins. It's a Nerf gun game. It's a game that involves teams shooting each other with toy Nerf guns. The officers came at them with guns drawn, confiscated all of the Nerf guns, and took one of the boys who had shot the dart into the squad car. I'm assuming this was either an accident or as a prank, but in any case, he told his friends later that he was verbally berated. An investigator called Berg about the complaint, and a few months later, he got a letter saying, "Though the discipline of officers is not public information, I apologize that you had a negative interaction with our officers." That's just one of many. Of Shelvin's 7 complaints since 2012. He's had 7 complaints since 2012. Records indicate that he was not disciplined for any of the 7 complaints. And they are all along these lines of aggressive overreaction, and just an overall disregard for the public at large. But we get more information about his partner, whose name is Tu Thao. We know about Thao that 5 of Thao's complaints were dismissed and 1 remains open, a case from 2017 involving Jenna Nelson. Officer Thao responded when Nelson called police after an assault. Her injuries weren't serious, but she wanted to file a report. Later, she followed up and even went to the precinct, where she learned that Thao never filed the report. She filed a complaint online with Minneapolis police, and 8 months later, she said an investigator reached out, and they had to apologize for the delay and confirmed that Thao had never filed a report either. At that point, either. But this is not the only case of that. Nelson's complaint echoes that of Luisa Fernandez, also in 2017, who said Wednesday that many people in the Hispanic community have felt mistreated by Thao. When Thao arrived, along with a female officer who stayed in the vehicle, there had been an altercation in a bar that they were at, where her brother had been assaulted in the bathroom, and they had a scuffle in the bathroom, and as a result, the security guard threw her brother down a flight of stairs. Now, I understand that this is a he said, she said incident. However, Fernandez wanted to report the security guard for assaulting her brother. But Thao simply walked over to the club owner. They spoke briefly, and then he told her there would be no report and that her party was to leave the club immediately, which may be par for the course. But the fact still remains that even though a report was requested, Thao still turned it down. There is a culture among these officers, and there's a continuing pattern of them going out to calls and not filling out reports from the call. They all handle it, quote-unquote, off the book. And why that is, we will get to later. Another complaint against Thao involves a black man who was held face down in an alley, but who actually lived to sue. He sued that the use of force complaint centered on an incident in October of 2014, in which Thao and his then partner were accused of punching and kicking Lamar Ferguson, the black man who was held face down in an alley, who they said was resisting arrest. The police closed the complaint without disciplinary action in 2017, but a related lawsuit to that incident resulted in a $25,000 settlement from the city of Minneapolis in 2018. The black male in question, Lamar Ferguson, suffered broken teeth and bruising during the incident. And this is just from what we know based on records of people who reported instances that were not reported. But there was a clear pattern of behavior with these officers of going to calls and not reporting when a report was certainly warranted. Again, for some odd reason, these officers were either trained or instructed or had a instinctive reluctance to make reports on incidents that they interacted with on the street. Now, that culture doesn't come from anywhere. That doesn't come from a vacuum. It doesn't come from doesn't spring from the ether, especially when something as basic as making a report and documenting your interactions, as police are wont to do. We know that there's been a shift of culture in the workforce, and we need to establish who is to blame for it. And to be perfectly blunt, as much as I want to roast Amy Klobuchar for having been the DA right at the end of one of these instances, she was in fact not acting DA at the time, nor would she have had enough time to make an influence, to have an effect on the case. Now, the district attorney at this time was a man named Mike Freeman. And he actually led the prosecution of a former police officer named Mohammed Noor. And Noor was convicted of murder and manslaughter in July of 2017 for the death of Justine Damond. Damond was a dual citizen of the U.S. and Australia who was shot when she approached Noor's squad car minutes after calling 911 to report a possible rape behind her home. This case made international headlines, by the way. Freeman, who is 71, has been the county attorney since 2007. He's also, coincidentally, the son of the late Orville Freeman, who was Minnesota governor and who served as the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture in the 1950s and 60s. So he is a somewhat connected figure. But the thing is, Mike Freeman doesn't seem to have a problem for charging or disciplining police for the wrongful deaths of citizens. His record seems rather squeaky clean on that. So, if Freeman was in fact going after wrongful deaths by the police as a district attorney, the question is, how does all of these other instances and everyone else keep slipping through the cracks? And so, if it's not a miscarriage of the legal justice system of Minnesota, this leads me to believe that this particular pattern of behavior falls squarely on the head of the chiefs of police and those in charge of the police forces locally and directly. And who are they? Well, let me tell you who these people are. The current chief of police of the Minneapolis Police Department is Menagerie, who is the first black person to serve as the chief of police in Minneapolis. He is a fifth-generation Minnesota resident. He joined the Minneapolis Police Department in 1989 as a patrol officer in the 4th Precinct. He worked his way up through the police ranks until he was named the inspector of the 1st Precinct. He once was a school resource officer and eventually a commander of the Internal Affairs Division. So we have a police chief who firsthand knows the tactics and methods of police officers who serve in internal affairs, who are the officers responsible for preventing and keeping watch over these behaviors in police officers that lead to the very actions that we saw, that should have been prevented, that should not have been allowed, that should have reasonably been, how else do you say it? This should not have happened, and the chief of police is intimately knowledgeable of their inner workings, which I find very interesting. Now, he was a deputy chief and assistant chief before being nominated as the chief of police. He was nominated after the resignation of the former police chief, Janie Harteau, who had to resign in 2017, shortly after the shooting of Justine Damond, whom the DA prosecuted and did not hesitate to prosecute. Now, the officer's full name was Muhammad Noor, and we'll get to those details a little bit later. But also, it is worthy to note that as police chief, Arredondo stopped the practice of low-level marijuana stings due to complaints about racial disparities. He also codified the relationship between police and emergency medical service providers in his current role as police chief. So we have one person with a direct knowledge of the internal. This is fascinating. He has direct knowledge, and he is the chief of police despite knowing the inner workings of the internal affairs part of policing, which I find very convenient. But he's not the only source of trouble. We have to go back to the diversity hire that came before him. And her name is Janie Harteau. We need to look into her because she had to resign abruptly amid the growing criticism from the public and the city council following the fatal police shooting of Justine. And this departure came at the request of the mayor, whose name is Betsy Hodges, who promptly nominated the current assisting chief, Arredondo, to replace Harteau. This move ended Harteau's 4.5-year run as the first woman and first openly gay person to head the department. Yes, this ended the career of the first woman and first openly gay person to head the department. And this is the pattern. Now, to get an insight as to the effectiveness of this particular police chief, let's look at what some of her work buddies had to say about her. Governor Mark Dayton criticized Harteau in 2013 for publicly announcing, before notifying his office, so this woman had a power trip issue, her plans to use the State Bureau of Criminal Apprehension to conduct investigations of police officers who seriously hurt or kill people while on duty, because apparently it was a problem back then too in 2013. More recently, however, in April, Hodges vetoed Harteau's choice for the Department's new 4th Precinct investigator, and their argumentative text exchange about it ended up becoming public. Harteau was also chief during several contentious events, including the police shooting of Jamar Clark, an unarmed black man in North Minneapolis in 2015. A council member at the time named Jacob Frey, who was running against Hodges for mayor, said he respects Harteau, but that stepping down was the right move. He says, quote, "Trust in our entire public safety branch of government has dwindled to zero, with police shootings and increasing violent crime." Another civil rights attorney who was running for mayor at the time, named Nakima Levy-Pounds, said Harteau needed to step down in the aftermath of several unnecessary police shootings during her tenure. She also called Harteau a hypocrite for seeming to treat Noor differently from white officers who had killed unarmed citizens in the past. Are you starting to get the picture of why there's a problem in Minneapolis? I'm just going to spell it out very, very clearly and succinctly so that you understand what is directly happening. The problem with Minneapolis, from what I saw from their leadership, from the people whom they are told to take lead from, is indeed systemic in nature. You have to understand that these issues, these problems with the Minneapolis and its police department are indeed systemic, and they will not stop at holding the foot soldiers accountable. Seeking the head of these officers will not solve the problem. Yes, we need to hold them accountable, but that's not what's going to stop the tragic dynamic that surrounds Minneapolis and its law enforcement dynamic. It's not going to fix it. Because the problem comes from the top. The problem comes from those who lead the police department. This pattern of behavior, this awful apathy, this reluctance towards accountability was directly caused by promoting diversity in law enforcement. The true root of the problems in Minneapolis are not actually racial in nature. They are rather caused by the application of failed ideology. The ideology that a person is qualified based on their diversity status rather than by the content of their character. That is why we have this problem in Minneapolis. Despite people calling for race war, despite people calling for black oppression and white supremacy and all these other buzzwords, it was, in fact, people trying to enforce and protect diversity quotas and what we can only call diversity hires. This is what caused that culture. They are trying to protect the image that everything is okay, when the very people that they have put into power are the ones who are complicit, absolutely complicit, in betraying the people that they were supposed to be called to serve. And I just needed to get this out because when I looked at it, I could hardly believe my luck. Because it is ironic, it is completely ironic that people who want diversity for its own sake could create a situation so bad that in order to save their own asses, their only recourse is to blame it on racial division in America. That's not what caused this. That's not what caused the police department to develop a culture of sweeping shit under the rug. What caused this was you putting people in positions of power who were unworthy of that position. That is what did this. It is not race. It is not blacks, it is not whites. It is the lack of character of those in power who allowed things to be swept under the rug for the sole intention of maintaining their power. And that, my friends, is the dereliction of diversity.